I really encourage people to use the chat to talk about how what I'm saying either agrees with or complements or even contradicts experiences that you've been having or seeing within your own communities. I really think that that is a space for conversation about something that we're all witnessing and addressing in our own communities. As August said, my name is Lana Ramjit. I'm the head of the National Resource Center on Cybercrimes, which is a very, very new resource center. It was commissioned within the past couple of years. We're still working on building our website, but our focus is really on crimes at the or crimes and behaviors at the intersection of gender-based violence, sexual violence, stalking, dating violence, and technology. So one of those is technology facilitated sexual violence. And this is a a topic that I think is very I think it evokes a lot of different responses when people just hear the title of technology facilitated sexual violence. Just because we think of sexual violence as so inherently, or we might think of it as so inherently being a contact-based crime, and we think of technology as being a distance-mediated format. So I really want us to explore and understand what sexual violence means and what technology facilitated sexual violence can mean. Before I dive into the actual content of this presentation, I do have to share the disclaimer that we are a federal technical assistance and training provider. That means that we can provide free training or technical assistance to anyone who is a potential OVW, Office of Violence Against Women grantee. So if you have questions or if you have cases that you would like technical assistance on, you're welcome to reach out to me or to go to our website and fill out our request form. And our services are free for anyone who is an OVW grantee, which are most advocacy organizations, victim services, and system-based folks. However, that does mean that this disclaimer is necessary that the material that is presented here is not necessarily reflective of the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. So this is the name of the resource center that I am building and creating. It is a joint effort because this spans so many different topics and areas. We have put together a coalition of experts that work on domestic violence at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which is an advocacy organization and victim service provider that runs a hotline for survivors of image-based abuse, the Stalking Prevention and Awareness Resource Center. It is National Stalking Awareness Month, and my supervisor would be very upset if I did not mention that. So definitely recommend checking out their resources and thinking about how that intersects with what we're talking about today. And the National White Collar Crime Association, which is a technical assistance and training organization for law enforcement and investigators who are especially looking to investigate digital evidence or online crime. So I'm starting off with this very simple definition of technology facilitated sexual violence, or TFSV, which is the use of technology to assist, amplify, or commit acts of sexual violence. And I think it's that latter word of committing an act of sexual violence that sometimes people have thoughts or questions about of how can sexual violence be committed through technology. And so I think it's actually more helpful to think about some examples of technology facilitated sexual violence. So one of the first examples that, again, it is National Stalking Awareness Month, is that cyber stalking is increasingly almost synonymous with stalking. And stalking involves more than just following someone. It's the disruption of someone's life, the invasion of their life and privacy, intimidation, and other behaviors in addition to just following someone. But technology has introduced many ways for someone to follow or track someone's location, and that is a behavior that often precedes or is part of sexual violence that can be an antecedent to an incident of sexual assault or sexual violence, or part of a larger pattern of sexual violence. Online grooming, where the internet and social media are used to find and identify it and begin relationships that can lead to other behaviors that are related to sexual violence, such as trafficking or assault. online sexual harassment, which again, I think, harassment is almost synonymous with online harassment at this point. We don't really think twice about the fact that harassment occurs through text messages, through voice messages, but we can even think of other ways of online sexual harassment happening or online harassment happening. That could even be repeated attempts to log into someone's account or posting information about someone online. And that can lead to crowdsourced sexual harassment, where we have people sending particularly intimate images, for example, or intimate information, personal information, and posting it online and directing people who are unwittingly, or sometimes wittingly participating in sexually harassing another person. Sextortion is an increasingly common and one that we'll talk about to some extent the impacts that sextortion has. Um, but when I say sextortion, I'm referring to the practice of um, in particular, the practice of threatening to release intimate images, intimate media of a person, sexual images or sexual media of a person, and using those threats in order to get certain behaviors for financial gain, and then also vice versa, right? Non-consensual distribution of intimate images is an unwieldy term, and we'll talk a lot about non-consensual distribution of intimate images because it's an increasingly prevalent issue for multiple reasons, not just because of deepfakes, but also because of just a growing change in social norms around intimate images and their distribution online. Recording or distributing sexual violence. And I think this is where we start to get into thinking about how sexual violence might not necessarily be just a contact crime, right? So this is often covered under multiple laws in terms of its criminality. But when we think about the viscerality of recording or distributing sexual violence, I've done many interviews with survivors of human trafficking and people who work with survivors of trafficking who have been sexually assaulted. And this was a recurrent theme of something that was one of the most um, powerful forms of coercion, something that where the threat of recording or distributing sexual violence, where often it was those threats were directed in a very personal manner, threatened to share with their family, with their friends, with their children, with their workplaces, in order to create a sense of shame, isolation, that if they were to leave, there would be nowhere for them to go back to, right? And there's already so much shame that people have when, as a survivor or a victim of sexual violence, that to have that shared in such a publicly disclosed way and for that to be out there sort of forever is something that I think has this particular viscerality around it that we associate with sexual violence and that we know in studies can actually have long-term effects that are very similar to sexual violence, acts of sexual violence itself. Cyberflashing, in which people receive images of another person that is sexual or violating in nature. Um, there was an incident, and again, I know that August had given a wonderful warning about this is heavy content. It is talking about sexual violence, and there is no way to talk about some of this without giving examples. So just a reminder again that if any of this is something where you need to take a break or would like to take a break, please do. But there was a very recent incident where thinking about what constituted sexual violence of someone where a person had taken a photo of someone that was not explicitly sexual, it wouldn't have fallen under the guidelines of what is considered sexual, and made a video of them ejaculating onto that photo and posted it online. Is that and then sent that video to that person. I think intuitively, morally, it's sort of we you can see that as a violation. We can understand why that would be in some ways some form of violating a boundary for someone, but it isn't actually covered by any law or any particular term or any, doesn't fit neatly into the statutes that we have. And that is a recurring theme that a lot of these behaviors are just creative enough that they don't necessarily fit neatly into our definitions of sexual violence. And cyberflashing is one where it exists very much in that area of what constitutes crossing a boundary when it comes to cyberflashing, especially when there are social norms on certain dating platforms where it is the norm to receive nude or intimate photos of someone without explicitly asking for permission, and that can be okay, right? And then lastly, one of the the cases that first drew me into learning more about technology facilitated sexual violence, and I'll share a little bit about my background, was, but I worked directly with victims and survivors of various forms of technology facilitated abuse. And some of the most memorable incidents were ones where, and this is not an isolated incident, where I worked with clients who had the person who was causing harm was creating profiles of them on dating apps, on hookup apps, saying that they had, I have a rape fantasy and this is my home address and I want someone to break into my, and like detailing the type of sexual fantasy that was outlining sexual assault, but it was not the client's profile, but the information about the address and the photos and everything were accurate. And saying, I want someone to come to my work and to have, this type of like sexual encounter on my lunch break, and having actual people show up to the workplace looking for this person. Right. And those kinds of things where just to see that information out there and then to also have actual people showing up, again, I think evokes that kind of viscerality where there's no contact really. Like there is no physical contact that's occurring in any of what I described, but the level of violation and the viscerality of what that person experienced is very much in the sphere of what we would consider sexual violence and what I consider to be sexual violence. And I want to put it out there that not everyone agrees with me. Some people feel very strongly that sexual violence should only refer to contact, and I welcome people to share their perspective and why they think that and to have that discussion. I think it's important to talk about it. But I will be talking about all of these things under the umbrella of technology facilitated sexual violence because that's where the literature has landed. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is so. So, some of you may have encountered or worked with survivors or victims of technology facilitated sexual violence, and they may probably did not call it that. It's very unlikely that they did. But one of the reasons for that is that they may be reluctant to label their experiences as sexual violence. And that can be, again, because of the emphasis on sexual violence. We've worked very hard as a community to think about sexual violence as, I think the sort of archetype had been someone hiding in a bush, coming out with a weapon and, jumping out and a stranger that's attacking someone. And that was like the kind of canonical image of sexual violence. And we've worked very hard to expand that to talk about sexual violence as a matter of consent and the fact that many of, if not the majority of offenders of sexual violence are known to the survivor or the victim, right? And so for many people, if when they're receiving these images or they're on the receiving end of these behaviors, they might not recognize it as being a form of sexual violence. And that can be really difficult because they're having the same physiological reaction, the same mental, emotional, and spiritual reaction to that type of violation, but they're not recognizing it as such. And it can make that dissonance can create even more difficulty in being able to process and address the harm that they're experiencing. One of the reasons that comes from this might be social reinforcement. So we do know that many survivors of these types of behaviors have had their experiences minimized, sometimes in a way that is intended to be comforting, not necessarily in a way that is intended to be minimizing, but to say like, oh, well, you can block them, right? Or like you can get away from this. And the fact that that option is there, first of all, doesn't necessarily mean that that will be effective in stopping those behaviors, because the type of people who cause this type of harm are usually persistent enough to find ways around it. And then the fear of waiting to see if your attempt to manage boundaries online was successful. For some people, you know, certain types of blocking or removing themselves from social media might not be an option. It might be more isolating for them. It may cut them off from, very needed sources of support. Um, but it also might just be that that sense that, oh, this is something that where if you just walk away from the internet, if you just walk away from technology, or if you just put the phone down and get away from it, it's not really capturing what the experience is for the survivor or the victim. They might have been told that it's not a crime, and they might very well have been received that information accurately. They might very well have not. I have been on, a lot of reviews, or consulted on many cases where sometimes very well-meaning advocates or law enforcement officers have told someone that this does not meet a statute or it's not a crime because of X, Y, or Z. And because of the peculiarities of the statute, they were wrong. They weren't trying to mislead them. They really did seem to care about the survivor or victim and they wanted to help, but just their understanding of these laws and statutes were that it's complex enough that they don't really know or understand when something is or isn't falling under a particular law. And I will be talking about the specific codes in Indiana to get a little bit of a sense of why it can be not necessarily so cut and dry whether or not something falls under a particular statute. But kind of thinking back to some of those earlier examples, some of these behaviors might be so creative or so sort of specific that they don't necessarily fall under any particular statute, and that might be accurate. But something not being a crime doesn't change the experience that the survivor or victim is having. And so we do want to still, understand that this is something that we're actively litigating and legislating and learning how to legislate and learning how it can actually be potentially prosecuted if that is what the survivor or victim is looking for. And again, because tech facilitated experiences might be seen as a disembodied, they might be given a lower status or in the survivor or victim's mind. So I also want to talk about evolving terminology. So I'm using the term technology facilitated sexual violence. You will hear technology facilitated sexual abuse, digital abuse, technology facilitated abuse. I will also be using the term non-consensual intimate images and also probably image-based sexual abuse. And that's because, again, this is a field that is relatively new. It's a set of behaviors that were very recently enabled. And so the discourse, the research, the search for language to capture these experiences is still an ongoing process. Um, and the terms that we use matter when we're talking about this as a community. Um, and the term that was the most prevalent in popular culture was revenge porn for a very long time. And it still is the most commonly used term, although it's increasingly falling out of favor with more official organizations. But in popular culture, it's still the term that I hear the most often is revenge porn. For a while, non-consensual intimate images kind of became to refer to this behavior of taking an image of someone that is sexual or intimate in nature, which is not in itself easy to define. That was the term that was favored. And then image-based sexual abuse became kind of the current standard within the research and academic community. I do still use non-consensual intimate imagery. And the reason for that is that not all images that are intimate and that can be harmful to be shared are sexual in nature, right? So when we think about community norms, when we think about, many of the effects that we think about when we think about what is the harm of image-based abuse is related to reputational harm, related to social repercussions, related to autonomy and control over your body and the way that you portray yourself in the world. And if we think about communities where, veiling is a common practice, there's a very large Orthodox Jewish community in my area. Where clothing of a certain length or certain behaviors are considered necessary for propriety, and it's a very personal decision for individuals in that community. So to have photos shared where someone is not necessarily, what someone outside of that community might consider sexual or might consider intimate might be very damaging and might be very intimate and personal to someone who is part of that community, and they might be experiencing severe social repercussions because of those images, but they just wouldn't fall under the laws that are defined image-based sexual abuse, if that makes sense. So this is an increasingly prevalent set of behaviors. It is hard to get prevalent studies just because what questions to ask, how to ask them, how to reach people, and funding for these studies is difficult. But there have been some very recent studies, most recently by my friend Rebecca Umbaug and Nicola Henry, who did a global study on image-based abuse. Which is one subset of the set of behaviors that constitute technology facilitated sexual violence. But one of the findings from that was that 1 in 7 people in the United States have experienced threats to share or had someone actually share their intimate images. And that 1 in 3 women have received a non-consensual sexual image. 1 in 4 people have experienced what we would consider severe sexual harassment online. So sexual harassment that is of a nature that is severe enough to be disruptive or to cause, mental, emotional, significant mental, emotional, or financial distress. And one of the other important findings from that is pretty uniform across the board is that young people, LGBTQ plus people, people of color, and women are more likely to experience technology-facilitated sexual violence. I do want to caveat that with a study that just recently came out by Asia Eaton, who is a researcher in this area that counterbalances that by saying that when the victims of deepfakes and image-based sexual abuse are men, they are less likely to be taken seriously, even though they are also more likely to experience specifically sextortion. And the reasons for that are partially because the men who are more likely to experience intimate image abuse are more likely to be part of the LGBTQ plus community. And so there is more of a foundation for blackmail because they are trying to protect certain aspects of their identity or the way that they're seen. And so the impacts on victims, I'm going to kind of start with the physical and say that there is absolutely a correlation of this being an escalation to in-person violence. In fact, we know that sexual violence is one of the highest risk factors for lethality in domestic violence. For example, so strangulation, sexual violence, and stalking are 3 of the top factors that precede lethality in domestic violence or an escalation of behaviors. One of the issues that I see in this field is that we don't have information on how technology facilitated sexual violence fits into that label of sexual violence as a lethality factor. We have very little information on how technology facilitated behaviors figure into our assessment of safety in an empirical manner. I mentioned that I should probably give some information about my background. So for 4 years, I ran one of basically the largest and at the time the only center that was a victim service provider specifically for technology facilitated abuse. So I was serving in partnership with the New York City Mayor's office was one of the constellation of services where if someone was reporting, like sexual assault, domestic violence, or trafficking and they were experiencing technology facilitated harms, they would be referred to us. And so I oversaw nearly 1,000 cases during the time that I was there, like as the director of the center. And so and I also, worked very hard for survivors who were asking for the involvement of the criminal justice system to push to get that involvement taken seriously and to work with DA's offices and investigators to actually figure out how to bring those cases and that evidence into the courtroom. One of the things that I can say from that anecdotal experience is that I did see that when something went from when a survivor is experiencing harassment, persistent harassment, and then that escalated to what I would consider technology facilitated sexual violence in the form of sexual harassment or intimate image abuse, that was much more common to be followed by an incident of physical violence. So in my opinion, I think there is good reason to believe that it is a risk factor for physical violence or for sexual violence. But again, the data that we have, like we do need empirical studies on this. Going to the other side of this, financially, sextortion has cost Americans over $8 million, and this is actually over just an 8-month period in 2022, according to the FBI. And so the FBI actually only has limited information about how much people have spent on sextortion. It is probably higher than that, and that means that it is probably well over, somewhere between the ballpark of 10 to 20 million alone in the cost that it has for Americans. And that is it's really difficult, really, really difficult to get information about this because often when people have paid for sextortion, or paid due to extortion, they are less likely to report. They're paying to avoid having to go to an institution or to go to an external institution to actually talk to someone about it. So they're less likely to report that crime overall. There is also a significant toll that it takes on job loss, time taken off of work. If you think back to that client I described who had, folks showing up to the workplace to, participate in, sexual fantasies that were not things that the person had actually put out there, that person did actually quit their job. In my opinion, very understandably so, right? Because they didn't feel safe, they didn't feel, and they didn't feel comfortable like returning to that workplace. So those two things together, there is a significant harm that can happen to survivors of tech facilitated sexual violence. But having worked directly with victims for many years, I cannot understate the mental toll that it takes on people. Because one of the things about technology and technology facilitated sexual violence is that, you know, if you are alone in your room, right, with no one around you and the door is locked, you might feel safe from physical violence. That might give you some sense of safety, right? But technology can reach into those very private spaces, right? Like you can't just scroll on your phone freely through social media. You are constantly waiting for the threat of that notification. I've worked with survivors who talk about just like the sound of that notification disrupting their work because just seeing the notification or hearing the sound of like the ping was creating a physiological response in them, like their heart would start to race and they would start to get panic because they had lived for so long even after it had ended because they don't know when it will have ended, right? So this can lead to isolation, anxiety, depression, PTSD. And empirically, one of the things that we do know is that it has much that survivors and victims of intimate image-based abuse, and I've been saying survivors and victims, and I say that intentionally because not everyone is a survivor of technology facilitated sexual violence, right? Some people are victims, some people this can lead to homicide, and I've worked on homicide review cases, and it also very not uncommonly can end in suicide. And so in honor of recognition of the stakes and the consequences, I'm fairly emphatic about going back and forth between survivors and victims because empirically it has one of the highest rates of suicidal ideation and suicidality than as any form of sexual violence. And that is in part in my, again, this is now somewhat anecdotal, partially because of the levels of isolation and the belief that they don't have anything to reach out to help about because they're not taking it as seriously. And there's this dissonance between the level of distress that they're experiencing and the level of help that they feel that they deserve or can ask for because of the nature of the experience. One of the other parts of the mental and emotional toll this can take on people is the sense of inescapability and the sense of permanence that technology facilitated behaviors can incur. So this is a quote from talking about video evidence of sexual violence. I think it resonates with not just that particular case, but with what I've heard from many survivors, which is that when something is put onto the internet, whether that be sexual harassment, whether that be an image, a video, whether it's the fake profiles or advertisements, there is a sense that it is out there and that they can never ever get rid of it. They can't get it back. This is also true for folks who enter this, who choose to proceed with pursuing criminal justice system solutions where those things are entered into evidence, and some survivors and victims might not realize that they cannot get it back, that they cannot take it back, and that will live on forever in the hands of whatever law enforcement they sent it to. And so there is forever trauma for the victims, and you can't measure it. Their families or colleagues or children, it's always going to be out there, and they're living with that fear that it's going to be out there. It also leads to ethical implications for those of us who work as victim service providers or who work as advocates, because there are people who have no memory of what has happened, or very little or very confused memory of what has happened, for a variety of reasons. And then we might have a video of the assault that is obtained one way or another. And ethically, do we and how do we show it to them? And this can be very tricky because we know that survivors' memories are often nonlinear, they're often fractured, and, you know, if there is actual video or photo evidence that contradicts what they genuinely believe to have happened, that can also be put us in a very difficult situation in terms of helping someone process and helping also, disclosing evidence and if that is the process that they're in. So kind of, nutshelling this, there's some unique harms that come from the technology facilitated aspects of this. One of them is its ability to extend reach through time and space. I mentioned, video evidence, but then the other part of that is that video evidence can be altered and photographs can be altered, but they can look very real. And so this can be a form of digital gaslighting where people no longer trust their sense of reality because, a message has been deleted or something has been erased or altered, and it looks very factual, it looks very trustworthy and real because we tend to think that, when you see a website for a store, you tend to think it's more real than if they don't have a website, even though that's very, tenuous. And so a falsified digital record can be very disturbing. It can bring in more strangers and just widen the scope and scale of crowdsourced harassment overall, and just in general amplify the scale of what a single individual is able to do. So we can think of people who are able to make multiple anonymous accounts and send harassment from all of them, which is not something that you can really do, without the aid of digital technology. So they're kind of creating multiple avatars of themselves to um and sometimes they're even impersonating other people and impersonating them well. And I've seen that happen many times where a survivor believes that it is a specific person and they're coming to me with believing that it is a specific person. And we are trained to, believe survivors as the experts of their own experiences. But when I'm looking at a digital, like a digital forensic analysis of something and it's not matching who they believe it to be, I've often been right. And that there are many instances of this happening where someone believes it's an ex-partner, but it's their current partner. And that is actually quite common. And so this does put us, again, as providers in a situation where we have to hold the truth of their experience while also looking at the facts that are in front of us and making sure that we are holding the right person accountable and protecting them from the right person, or helping them protect themselves from the right person. This is from an interview that I did with a trafficking survivor, who, had exited the trafficking situation about 20 years later. And they said, not 20 years later, but they had been out of it for a significant amount of time, like some 7 to 10 years. And they said that somebody contacted her and said, "Hey, I just saw you on Pornhub." And she was like, "What do you mean?" And so she goes and she checks the link and she finds out that this video of her being sexually assaulted was on Pornhub and posted multiple times, like multiple different videos. And she had no idea. And she had no idea how long it had been on there, how long it would stay on there, and if it's still on there. She did contact the company at the time to request that they take it down. And they said, "You were not the person who posted it, so you don't have permission to take it down, even if you are the person who's in it." And so eventually Pornhub went through a big reckoning, where it took down the overwhelming majority of user-generated content that was not, professionally produced and licensed. But so it probably is down now. But for this particular survivor who had children, who had a new job, was living with the fear and the knowledge that anyone could just find that their kids could see it if they went on this website and just happened to browse and find it through no fault of her own. So I've been touching on and bringing in, trafficking, domestic violence, stalking. I'm not going to talk as much about grooming because this is focused more on adults and grooming is associated with younger adults. But um, or children, and dating violence. And I just want to kind of pull all of that together and just remind everyone, which, I'm sure many of you are well aware, that sexual violence does not happen in a vacuum. It happens as a co-occurring part of often of a pattern of other behaviors. It can happen on its own, but it very often is happening in accompaniment with stalking, with domestic violence, dating violence, trafficking, and a variety of other behaviors. So how do victims actually respond? Um, about 1 in 3 victims of image-based abuse never tell anyone about their experience, not even the platform that it is posted on, not a friend, not a family member. And so that means, about 2/3 tell at least one person, but a full 1 in 3 people are not telling anyone whatsoever. And 3 in 5, so the overwhelming majority, do not bother reporting it to either the platform that it was posted on or the police. So they're not even seeking to stop or attempt to have it taken down. There's a lot of reasons why, and we are still learning about the reasons why people respond the way that they respond, so that we can better help change and cultivate those attitudes. Part of it is just that, you know, increasingly culturally it's seen as normal. Or they think that the person who posted that image of them without their permission didn't really do anything wrong. Many teenagers don't identify it as sexual assault, so we know that, like, as our culture is consistently turning towards not viewing these behaviors as sexual violence or sexual assault, and so they don't do anything about it and they just leave it. And again, many people just feel that they will be blamed, that it is their fault for that video or image to have existed, and so they don't see a point in reporting it. A lot of this is about the shame, about self-blame, about being dismissed, and about not being believed. There is an interesting tension that's come up around deepfakes where the ability to artificially generate photos of someone who is removing clothing or that is sexual in nature that are not real has highlighted the fact that for folks who have videos or images that are real that they did take and they may have shared consensually for a variety of reasons, whether they felt pressured into it by social norms, whether they were in a long distance relationship and that was just part of how they maintained intimacy. In almost all cases, um, outside of trafficking, like the overwhelming majority of cases, these videos or images are obtained consensually. They're not like stolen from hacking. It's that they trusted the person or they had a specific relationship with that person when they sent it to them. And that is the group of people who are the least likely to actually report um, or reach out for help because of the sense of shame and blame that they feel. And this is very common with people who are exploring their sexuality and they feel safer doing it online or with a stranger as well. And when I say exploring sexuality, I mean just like it could be their sexual orientation, but it could also just be that they're, generally exploring their sexuality in the sense of just what they're comfortable with sharing with another person. And so we have some information about the cultural attitudes towards tech facilitated sexual violence, where when we look at, the image itself, the more revealing the image is, the more sexual the image is, the more the victims are perceived as being promiscuous and more blameworthy. And yet when those same group of people, or a similar group of a cohort of people were asked about deepfake pornography, when it was labeled as fake, respondents recognized that as being highly harmful and deserving of punishment. So we have this dichotomy about who is an actual victim and what kind of support that do different survivors and victims deserve, depending on the nature of the experience that they're having. And this is a question that I get all the time that I've been alluding to is this actually violence? And I'm not here to answer this question. I'm here to invite people to think about and talk about and think about what that means for your organization and how you choose to treat it and how that might impact survivors in the context of all of these other, ramifications and other things that we're talking about. So I'm going to skip a little bit because we're a little bit behind, and I want to make sure that we talk about what you can do, right? So I'm going to skip over barriers to reporting. I will just say that every state now has a law that criminalizes image-based abuse in some form. The specific statute varies, so we'll talk about what Indiana's is, but this is very recent. So up until, 5 to 10 years ago, this was not a crime in most places. So, Indiana Code 354548, this is a Class A misdemeanor. It can be escalated to a felony under certain limited circumstances, but in general, it is a Class A misdemeanor. It defines intimate as depicting sexual intercourse, sexual conduct, or exhibition of the uncovered buttocks, genitals, or female breast. It is, the conversations about how to define intimate are older than I am alive, so I'm not even going to touch that, but that is just informing you of what this is in the statute in Indiana. If you are not in Indiana, I've been informed that some people are from other states. Feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to share the code for your particular state. One of the interesting questions we have is identifiability. What does it mean for someone to be seen in a photo? So if you think about a photo where the face isn't visible, for example, what claim does someone have there? And this has come up. It just needs to appear to depict the victim. So in general, if the victim is saying, if the person, like if you have a survivor or victim who's saying, that's me, that's usually enough. And that includes for the Indiana law does include artificially generated images. I have great news for Indiana. There is no intent to cause harm in the standard for Indiana. That doesn't necessarily mean that you won't have to say like that there might not be some conversation about intention and that might not come into play. But one of the issues that we have in general is that like with harassment and stalking, there is often an intent to cause harm where you need to show that the person who sent the message had the intention of hurting that person. And that can be difficult to prove in terms of evidence. And that is a big roadblock for a lot of survivors who are seeking justice through the criminal justice system or through civil suits as well. Because they can like it's very easy for someone to say, and sometimes it might even be true that they just didn't think about it, right? Like they were just having fun, they were just bonding with their friends, they wanted to financial gain. I was posting this to get money. We'll remove this from that behavior from states that have an intent to cause harm standard because their intent was financial gain and the harm is incidental, right? So in Indiana, there is no mention of an intent to cause harm standard. And then there is also more broadly a federal law, which is the 2025 Take It Down Act, which this law criminalizes the person who shared the photo, the distribution of the photo itself. There are other laws that cover blackmail and obscenity that are older than this, but this is the newest one. And that covers the person who distributes it. There is now also about to be on May 20th, 2026, it will go into effect, a law that criminalizes platforms for hosting those images. So the person who shared it and the platform will both have criminal liability as of May 20th, 2026. So platforms have a 48-hour grace period to remove non-consensual intimate images once it is reported to them. And that includes synthetic images. And if they don't, then they are subject to criminal penalties. There is an umbrella of other potential statutes that can be useful for someone who is seeking, again, criminal justice solutions or efforts in order to address their situation. That can be everything from fraud, stalking, doxing laws, blackmail, and very, very frequently violation of a protective order. So what we call an order of protection. I'm sorry, my cat is sneezing very violently. She's fine. So a restraining order or a protective order, this is considered a violation, and that's usually a pretty quick route. So I do want to talk about what you can do if someone has images or media that is being displayed online, how you can help. So standard search images are actually really great at finding information about someone, and often these images are posted with identifying information. So there is a Google tool called Results About You that you can use and set up that will monitor when information about you is posted or being showing up in search results. And then it also includes instructions for how to attempt to take down those to take down that media if it should come up, and also just generally personal information like addresses as well, which might be something that people want removed. Utilizing things like reverse image search, like Google reverse image search, fisheye lens, those that you can search for reverse image searches tools, and then you can try and reverse image searching for that photo. There is such a thing as hash value search services. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But I want to talk about reverse image searches because there are scams where there are that will use like very similar names and URLs to get people to upload explicit content in order to again take advantage of it. So just a word of caution to be very sure that the site that you're using is the site that you think it is. And I definitely recommend, would recommend using Google because I think it's easier to verify the Google domain because we are familiar with it. So looking in the address bar of your browser and making sure that you're actually at google.com. And it will show you which website is hosting and have requests and help submit requests to remove that content. So there is something called hash value search services, and they are basically something that will take an image and they will process that image in a way where they generate a key that will only match that photo. So they don't have information about the original photo. They just have this key that basically like is uniquely associated with that image. And it is can tolerate like cropping or, like very minor changes to the photo. And then they can use that key to basically for every other image that appears, they can run the same process over those images and see if it generates the same key. And in that way, match two photos without having actually seen the original photo. The point of this is that you can submit an explicit photo, generate the key for it, and then that can be used to prevent the photo from showing up in other places or identify if it is being showed up in other places without having to actually give the explicit image to the whatever is actually performing that search. This is really important because there is a service called stopncii.org that uses this type of technology to prevent public posting of intimate images on some platforms. And it's important to know that when you use the service, it does not actually require you to give that image or to stopncii.org. What you're doing is you're temporarily giving it access to the image so that it can generate a key. The only caveat to that again is that you have to have access to the image that you're concerned about being posted in order for it to work. Um, the other important tool for content takedown is using copyright as a tool. Again, if you have a copy of the image. Unfortunately, DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, was just so much quicker in removing photos for a very, very long time. I think that as the culture has changed, as new laws have been introduced, hopefully the Take It Down Act will be as quick as DMCA. But for a period of time, the fastest and most assured way for someone to be able to remove intimate images of themselves was to copyright it and file a copyright request, which says something about the way we view property versus autonomy legally, but it is still a tool that I think should be in our toolbox. Generally speaking, the process for content removal does require a court order, and I'm just going to kind of blow over most of this and say that I would generally suggest enlisting professional help with folks who have done this. And Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, stopncii.org, and Not Without My Consent are all three services that have a lot of experience in navigating the process of getting a court order for content removal, and all of those, and all of the intricacies, because one of the issues with trying to create presentations about this is that the mechanisms are changing very quickly, enough so that that information can go very stale. So the folks who are doing this regularly and in large volumes will have seen a wider variety of what is currently working, and that can be the most helpful. So let's see. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is that Chen is chen.org, CHAYN.org, has something called Survivor AI. And I'm going to just sort of cautiously recommend checking that out for Take It Down Act requests, because basically what it is a tool that will automatically generate a takedown letter for companies where basically they have to comply with the Take It Down Act to remove something. I find that survivors writing those letters themselves or trying to file it can be very traumatizing. It can also be a difficult or opaque process, and they're not really sure what information to include. So I am generally supportive of a generative AI service that can, solicit some information, the relevant pieces of information, and collate that into a coherent letter to share with the platform. That would up the chances of the platform having the information it needs to actually take it down within 48 hours with minimal harm to the survivor or minimal re-traumatization for the survivor. And because I do know and trust the folks that are at Chen that they do not actually retain that data and that it is created in a way that is privacy preserving and survivor centered, I cautiously recommend it. It's just a new enough tool that I don't have a lot of experience with actually using it, especially because that law is not actually in effect yet. So I'm going to end there because I know that we are at time. I believe this is an hour. And I'm putting my contact information up here. I did not get a chance to look in the chat yet, so I don't know if there are questions that I've missed, but I am happy to stick around and ask anything and answer
Sure.
anything there are.
Thank you so much, Lana. The last 30 minutes we usually leave open. So if anybody has questions, this is the beginning of our live Q&A session. Please feel free to throw those in the chat, or if you would like to go ahead and raise your hand, we can call on you.
Absolutely. I know I skipped over a little bit of information towards the end there, so if anything in there is something that you wanted me to actually get into, I'm happy to talk about it. Thanks. Yes, I will share the slides for this presentation with August, who can distribute it to attendees.
Yes, and we will have the recording of today's session online as soon as we can so that you can have that presentation and the recording. So feel free to pop off of mute if you've got any questions here for Lana. Well, Lana, maybe I can ask a little bit of it's the beginning of 2026. What do you see coming in the year for, your area of expertise, maybe the future of what we talked about today?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that are going to be very open questions. I think that the implementation of the Take It Down law is in itself going to be very interesting to see how impactful that is for survivors and how it's used and what some unintended consequences might be because of it. I so that just logistically, I think will be interesting and hopefully positive for survivors. There were some concerns about some of the language in that law being too vague in terms of defining what what a request would be. So if that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But I do think I'm interested to see how that will hopefully positively impact survivors and victims. I think the other thing that we will have to grapple with is around questions of artificial intelligence and um, the generation, the profit that folks are making off of nudification. They're called nudification apps. So something that can take a photo of someone who is clothed and generate a nude photo of them. I'm a computer scientist by training, so my background was actually quite technical. And in terms of technical training, one of the issues that we see coming up repeatedly is that right now it is not okay for researchers and for platforms, industry platforms to, for instance, test with non-consensual intimate images of real people or child sexual abuse material, for example, even if that work is intended to prevent those systems from creating it. And this is something that creates an issue where basically, in order to get data on how those systems can be abused, they have to wait until they're used to abuse actual real people non-consensually, right? So they have to wait until they get that data from actual crime, hope that it gets reported. They can't actively do that work. And so this has led to, those systems being very far behind, where, for instance, they would say, what does compositionality mean in those systems? Where, like, if I have an image of, like, you know, a nude person and I have an image of a specific person, can you compose those together? If you have images of children, of nude adults, can you compose those together to create a nude image of a child? They can't answer those questions because they aren't actually able to use that data and that information. And that is a regulation that was put in place with good intentions. So I think that that's going to be, in terms of how we're actually able to be preventative and proactive in understanding how the systems work. That is going to be a huge issue where it's going to be continually on the back step of waiting for those things to actually come up. I think the other big issue that is tangentially related, to not fully in the sexual violence category, but I think it's really important for folks to know is that one of the things that we see very often is anonymous harassment, and that it's very difficult to know who is the person behind the messages, behind sharing the images. And I've alluded to several cases I've worked on where the person or the survivor that I was working with really believed that it was an ex who had been abusive in the past, or that, they had good reason to believe it was that person. And then through the digital forensic investigation, I suspected that it was someone else, that it was a friend, that it was their current partner. And I had to, in order to bring that concern to the person, I needed evidence. And to get that evidence, I needed the platform to tell me who sent this message. I needed that kind of evidence. That is protected information. So to preserve our privacy online, telecom platforms cannot share information about what you send to other people to anyone. They're not allowed to. It's a privacy preserving thing. And it's something that is a good thing, right? Like we don't want, like our bosses or friends or family to just be able to find out what we were doing online. Our communications are private and they're very heavily protected. But this means that we have to get, like I had to involve DAs and prosecutors to file the right subpoenas and the right legal processes in order to find out who it was. And one of the issues with that is that there's a law that outlines all of this, like who can request this information from these companies and under what circumstances. And that law says that only federal prosecutors, state prosecutors, and investigators can request this information. They did not include tribal investigators. They did not include tribal prosecutors. They did not include criminal defense attorneys. They did not include um, several other, stakeholders that really genuinely should have that. So if you're being accused of a crime, of sending an intimate image, and it's not you, someone's impersonating you, your criminal defense attorney cannot actually get that information. They don't have the legal right to. They have to force a prosecution to do that. And then the other issue is that there is no time limit on how long those telecom platforms have to respond. So this typically is taking like 120 days minimum for these requests to be answered, if at all. And so talking with tribal prosecutors, they were like, well, we just never get an answer. And they don't even realize that it's because they don't have the legal authority to, because the volume of requests is so high that they don't actually give a reason why those requests are denied overall. So I think that we do actually need to have some laws around, like, there's no financial incentive for a company to invest in the infrastructure to like hire more people so that it's actually able to respond faster. That's something that's going to require like regulation, but it's a really touchy area of legislation because of the impact on privacy. I do see some questions while I was babbling.
No, thank you so much.
For a minor being bullied, how can you check to see if there's been images made of them without their knowledge? So that's a good question. It's also a tough question for a number of reasons, which is it relates to identifiability. Like, what is an image made of them, right? If it's a deep fake image, like how close does it have to be to them? And we also can't know if it's being made, right? Like that we have to know, we can only know if it's being posted or if it's being shared. And again, this runs into some questions of privacy, because in our private text messages, the companies that send, like your telephone company can't listen to your conversation, right? Like Verizon can't listen to you having a conversation. And that has been historically a very good thing. And it is a good thing. Like it is basically what is the foundation of us having privacy in this country. But what that does mean is that extension of that principle means that you can't actually check someone's private messages to see if they're sending an image of someone. You can only see when it's being posted publicly, because those companies typically don't have access to the images that are being sent on their platforms, often for privacy reasons. Some of them do. It depends on the platform. So ultimately, what we can look is there an image that is close enough of this person being posted online. And the closest that we can get is that in order for someone to post that image online, they have to include their name of that person, right? Like they will typically post it with the name of the person who's in it in some way or some type of identifying context if it's a fake image. And so what you can do is you can, first of all, if you know that there's a set of images that the minor in particular is concerned about having online that they have, like that they took of themselves, building a good relationship with the person that you're working with and actually making sure that, that they like can feel safe, like saying this to the person that you're talking to is important, but then actually reverse image search will help you match exact photos. And then keeping a Google alert or other information for search results about a person is helpful. But again, if you're dealing with an issue that's related to a minor, I exclusively have the purview to work with adults 18 and over. So I'm kind of drawing on my knowledge of like transition age youth here. You really do want to go look to resources like NCMEC and other institutions that focus on minors and on children to make sure that you're getting the advice that is specific and tailored to minors in that case. So I would definitely recommend. NCMEC has been actually really great about releasing information and data and on digital abuse, and they had released reports early saying that the reports of digital abuse of children had I can't remember how much it was, but it had like doubled or something. And so they released it early because they were like, hey, we're seeing like a really heavy peak, like a really high wave of this happening among youth. And so, they are trying to reach people because I think that's something that we're seeing for many, many reasons happen a lot more frequently.
I think Whitney would like to ask a question. Whitney, if you would like to come off of mute.
Hi, Lana. Thank you so much for this information. I think it is so helpful and also just so involved, I think, in a way that perhaps a lot of us are not familiar with. So the prevention team here at ICESA works really closely with lots of colleges and universities around the state of Indiana. And we are hearing more and more frequently that some of the campus-based advocates and Title IX staff at these colleges and universities are working with students who have experienced some of this technology facilitated sexual violence. And I'm wondering, do you have any suggestions for us or for them kind of in how to be aware of not only like reporting requirements kind of on campuses, but also how some of this works in regard to Title IX requirements at the federal level, as well as like Clery reporting requirements. I know that's kind of a very detailed question, but any information or thoughts that you have kind of specifically around college campuses and some suggestions for them would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually am on the New York City, like the New York State Alliance Against Sexual Assault for their colleges and campuses. So I do for this particular topic exactly. So I do have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm not going to touch Title IX because I am not a Title IX expert, but I will say that we do actually on in my organization we have someone who's specializes on campus support in Title IX, and so I would be happy to connect you with her. And it actually this might be a space for her and I to work together on creating specific guidance around this if it doesn't already exist, just to answer that question because it is, I think everyone is seeing and facing this. One of the things that I think is so unpopular of a response is that we need to think about not just survivors and victims, but we need to think about reaching offenders. And we also need to stop seeing those populations as being distinct and non-overlapping. People who are survivors and victims of technology facilitated sexual violence can also be the person who is causing harm in that manner. And it is partially because once it happens to them, they might feel like, oh, well, this is a normal thing for me to be able to do to someone else. It wasn't that bad when it happened to me, so it's not that bad for me to do it to someone else. This is just what we do, right? So it is especially an age and an area where talking about why people do engage in these behaviors, sometimes it's just homosocial bonding. Like sometimes it's just to, like because of social pressure, because they want to look cool, because they want to say that they're like talking to like so and so. Um, and they're not really thinking through the consequences. I think to paint the people and the offenders and the who engage in these behaviors as like irredeemable monsters at a point when we just culturally have ingrained, and we're hearing repeatedly, and I included those quotes, from youth saying that this is often considered normal. And so for to tell someone who's doing what they think is normal, what they think is healthy sexuality, and telling them like you're committing a crime, it can be really difficult. That can be, a very, very, and that is a position that Title IX puts you in, because you are saying like you did violate Title IX in doing this, and like you cannot, cut corners on saying that. That's an obligation. So trying to reach the cultural attitude, the cultural root of it, and also addressing the shame and the stigma. I think that one of the advantages of technology is that we do know that, survivors of all ages prefer to get their information from not a person. They prefer to get it from a chatbot. They prefer to get it from ChatGPT. They prefer to get it from, Reddit. They don't want to talk to a person. They're not ready to disclose. And when the option is there to talk to a non-human entity about their experiences, inevitably, especially younger generations will take it. And I think that college campuses need to address that. Like there have services for people to go and talk to people, but like it's just not going to be the first line service that most youth are going to want to go to. They're going to want to talk to ChatGPT. And so can you give them an alternative that feels as safe and as impersonal, if that's what they're looking for, that is sanctioned by the school and that is accurate, that is privacy preserving, because ChatGPT is not, right? And they don't know or understand that. So I understand the deep, deep caution that people have about AI and chatbots and their use in survivor services, and I think that that is prudent. But I also really encourage people to think about how they can be used safely to encourage people to access a resource that can help start the beginnings of destigmatizing, of not minimizing, of encouraging them to reach out for help, to say, like, hey, if you're having a really hard time mentally processing something that happened to you and you feel like that's not a big deal, that's normal. And it's because it is a big deal, right? And like you should reach out to counseling, or it is fine to reach out to counseling. That's an appropriate and proportionate response to what you've experienced. Um, that's huge. So I would say those are the two things that I think don't get brought up as much, that in my professional opinion are important.
That is so awesome. Thank you for that. I think you definitely segued in our minds to our SUSOP program. I think that the college age audience is just so key to reach. It's very much a time of change and of learning. And, if people are in that cycle of abuse or assault, I think now is definitely a key time that we could step in, or that others can step in. And Whitney definitely is, the expert in that area. So thank you so much, Lana, for answering that. Are there any other questions? Please feel free to put them in the chat. Michael just shared about our prevention programs in the chat as well, if you would like to go ahead and click that link. But yeah, please feel free, if you have a question, come on off of mute and ask Lana, or drop it in the chat. We're happy to answer that.
And also feel free to reach out via email if you don't want to ask your question in a public forum. That's truly what we're here for. So I will put my email in the chat. It is hard to spell. I recommend using copy paste because people always spell it wrong, and then they reach out to my personal professional email. Like, you never answered me. And then they send me the email and it's like the wrong email.
Totally wrong.
It's a lot of vowels. But I'm so honored to be here, and thank you so much for sharing your time with me. This is a topic that I hope it comes across that I am very, passionate about, and that I very much like. I enjoy talking to people about it and hearing different perspectives. And I want to hear other people's perspectives, even if they don't necessarily align with the things that I'm putting forth. I think it's a good conversation to have. So please feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again, Lana. It's just such an important topic and a timely topic. So we appreciate you educating us on it. And thank you so much to all of our guests today for joining us with open minds. We would also like to take a chance to invite you to register for our next training. Our Coffee with the Coalition is next Tuesday, the 20th, with Genevieve Meyer, and she is with the Indiana Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, and she will be presenting on protecting youth in a digital age. That session will explore just how social media and online platforms impact youth safety, mental health, and vulnerability to exploitation. We'll examine some current trends in online grooming, some trafficking, and digital exploitation, and helping participants recognize some warning signs and understanding how perpetrators can target online youth or youth online. So we will drop that in the chat as well. We're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat. So thank you again, Lana. And again, our training does start at 10 a.m. We run from 10 to 11:30. So please feel free to reach out if you do have any other questions. Reach out directly to Lana, or you can email info@endsexualassault.org or training@endsexualassault.org. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you. Thanks, Lana.